The losers are grimmest. The loser is saying, I feel for Kalbatar, who ran the winning campaign.
Well,
it's weird.
It's weird, and Kalbatar, that was the most extraordinary address. I mean, it seemed like he'd sort of wandered off the set of Fantasy Island, frankly. He was trying to promote a set of principles, if you like, to justify the previous 3 years and the shocking campaign, but he was contradicting himself at all times. I mean, he was talking about, you know, the comparisons or the way Tony Abbott had to compare himself was off a fairly low base. In other words, that they were doing so appallingly that all he could do was just get better in a minor sense and he'd do all right.
Yeah, but still there was the fundamental argument. They went into the campaign at a winning position, then the leaks happened, and they took a terrible hiding and only just recovered to minority government status.
But but the way Labor would say, some Labor people would say it, is that they were actually on a worse hiding than what they were. I don't think that you can justify, or Kalbatar or anyone can justify, pinning a couple of things like the leaks on the previous 3 years, the standards that the voters set for the government during the election campaign.
Yeah, except that the figures he used were quite stark, that there was a 6% swing against them in New South Wales and 9% in Queensland within 48 hours of the leaks occurring, David.
The leaks were devastating, but let's not forget some of the completely ridiculous things that Labor went into the election campaign. The People's Assembly. I mean, here was a party in diabolical trouble because it had backed away from doing something about global warming. That demand of our communities that something be done about global warming is shaping the whole of the politics of this country at the moment in one way or another, with the resurgence of the Greens and all of these kinds of things. And what does Julia Gillard do? She puts up this completely ridiculous notion that some randomly picked citizens will decide the fate of the nation's policies on global warming. That was devastatingly stupid thing to go into the campaign. Now, the leaks, of course, were dreadful for Labor, but that was also dreadful. And there were other dreadful things going on. It's too easy to say leaks, leaks, leaks. This was the worst campaign from both sides in about 50
certainly
years.
Graham Richardson's view. Piers?
Yeah, I agree to extent, Barry. People tend to forget things very quickly. But you've got to remember that Gillard said this was a government that has lost its way. They chopped the first serving Prime Minister in the history of the nation. And what policies did they come up with to replace those which they felt were so execrable that they had to ditch their Prime Minister? Well, essentially the same.
Michael Kroger said at Paul Howe's book launch during the week that he had it on good information that Julia Gillard had told a Melbourne businessman a week out from that day, Wednesday, June 23, a week out, that there could be a leadership change. How much credibility would you give that?
Not a lot. And I think that there was certainly a lot of talk around about there being a leadership change, but not exactly then. There had been people urging it as a survival mechanism, but in terms of that actual 48 hours or 24 hours, really, that was, as you know, and as everybody here knows, was something that did occur almost like some sort of, you know, spontaneous combustion.
I disagree that it was that spontaneous, because I was speaking to a Labor senator on the week before the thing, and he told me that it was going to happen. I wrote about it on the Sunday beforehand, saying that there was to be a change, although I didn't realise it was going to be that week.
That's what I'm talking about, that change, that
week. When I
week.
called him back and said, why didn't you be specific? He said, I didn't want to be specific. He said there was a group of us. They called themselves the Knights Templar. There were 3 or 4 of them.
That's a bit creepy.
That's right.
Very creepy.
Well, it was a joke. It was a Labor joke. But they had been meeting for a long time, and he told me how, in fact, that they approached various others to join their group, including Gary Gray, who has made a lot subsequently about his disquiet, but he was a very reluctant starter for that.
But there was a lot of disquiet, wasn't there? There was a heap, but the actual 24-hour time frame.
But this fellow told me that when he's, you know...
Gary Gray was not a reluctant starter. He said subsequently, he spoke to me for my book back in March, April, and his feelings were fairly clear then.
Yeah, but he didn't want to join the organised push.
What's important about what Kroger is saying, if true, is that Gillard was in on it. This is what's new about what Kroger is saying. Now, we heard, there have been rumours around about this at the time.
I don't discount it at all.
I don't discount it, but I would like a bit more detail, please.
Sure.
Kroger talks about 1 or 2 or 3 businessmen. He doesn't say what line of work they're in. He doesn't say they spoke actually to him. I'd like a bit more detail, but I think it's a very
David,
people
don't normally give up their sources that easily.
I'm not talking about giving up sources. I'm talking about a little more specificity about where it came from. But it's terrifically interesting.
One other thing that Michael Kroger did say that was intriguing, really, was on the reference to the leaks. He had this to say.
There can be no other person than Rudd. Oaks had 2 very significant leaks, and I'm in no doubt myself, although I haven't got this from Oaks, but I'm in no doubt that Rudd had a conversation with Oaks on the evening of Wednesday the 23rd of June. He gave those leaks to Oaks on June the 23rd, but I don't think since. And once having given that information to Oaks, Rudd had no control over when and where and how it would be used.
Now, look, this is really interesting in this sense. It's only a theory. It's only a theory. He seemed quite confident about it, nevertheless. But what he's saying is that on the night after Kevin Rudd had spoken with Julie Gillard and he knew that it was all over, that sort of in a sense of frustration, there was this outpouring to Laurie Oaks, somebody that he often spoke to. Now, if that's true, Oaks then had all of this information on that night. It was then in his hands when he would use it, and he used it at a time when it would have the most impact. In other words, he saved some of this material for right in the middle of the election campaign. So if that was Laurie Oaks' decision and not Kevin Rudd's, it's not as devious an act as maybe some people have accused him of.
You're saying not as much calumny can be delivered on Rudd?
Yes.
Well, I agree, but then I think that it does question Laurie Oaks' values as a newsman, why he sat on these and didn't share them immediately with the public. Now, Barry, he might have been doing it to enhance his own career, which is a possibility, or to be a strategic political player. I'm unhappy with news people who get what is obviously a scoop, or a series of scoops, and who then sit on them for whatever reason.
Maximum political impact.
But we actually have to be very careful here that this is a theory from Kroger. It's not been confirmed or denied or anything by Laurie Oaks, so all we can do is just say, well, this is the way it could be viewed if indeed that's what happened.
I haven't read Laurie's
book. If you were given the material,
K.A.,
if you were given the material, would you go with it immediately?
Yes.
You would. And
well, because
why
it's a red-hot story.
Rather than
because we're not...
split the two and have two goes at it?
Well, you could split it over 48 hours, but it was such a significant political time that if indeed it occurred, they were significant news stories, and to sit on a news story, if indeed this is what happened, for your own reasoning around having maximum political impact, particularly in the highly political context of an election.
Gord, this makes me feel uncomfortable. I mean, there is this whole series of hypotheticals
about
whether this happened.
David,
and also, I feel very uncomfortable about the notion of journalists sitting around laying down laws about when stories should be published. Why can't journalists hold on to stories and eke them out? I think, isn't it something we all do?
Well, I just think
there's too many hypotheticals in this.
David,
I'm really uncomfortable with it.
David, let's not talk about the actual...
I'll take all your hypotheticals, but on the position of journalists, I think that your reading public would expect you to share with them a newsworthy event.
Let's not relate this at all to the Laurie stuff, then.
No, I'm not relating it to that.
I'm not sure that you can
and I've got to say this,
rule.
that I've read Barry's book, I've skimmed Bob Alice's book, Paul House's...
You brute. Skimmed. And he's so kind to you in it.
Is he? I must have missed that paragraph. But I've read Paul House's miserable little pamphlet on the plane yesterday, and why he ever bothered doing that, which, is beyond me. But I haven't read Laurie's book. It may well be that he makes some references. Has anybody here read his book?
Yes.
Has anybody here...
He doesn't make any reference to it?
No.
Okay.
He certainly doesn't clear up that aspect of it. Now, the other interesting thing about Michael Kroger is that on the coalition side of politics, they've essentially moved to portray Julia Gillard as the villain here, that she was the cruel assassin. Michael Kroger takes a very different view. He says that Kevin Rudd brought it all on himself.
He is a brooding, potentially ultimately destabilising force, a man who almost brought down this Labor government in the most horrific political way, a treacherous and traitorous individual sitting there in the Cabinet. And I praise Julie Gillard and the members of the Cabinet for having the courage to go to Cabinet meetings every week and sit there and look at Kevin Rudd, a man who they know tried his best to destroy the government.
Yeah. Well, Kroger can't match Howe's for bitterness about Rudd.
Well, Kroger's been in the political game for 2 decades too. I mean, when it comes to knifing leaders and treachery and treason and all the rest of it, there's a hell of a lot of it on that side also. So, I mean, I don't think he can speak with authority on what happens within the Labor caucus or the Labor leadership.
Gee, Kerry, and there's so much evidence that's come out of from other people within Labor.
Well, let people who have actually been involved in it make those judgments. I mean,
well, he's just repeating what everybody in Labor said.
Not everybody, and hovering over what Kroger says, of course, is the judgment of John Howard that Rudd would have won the election easily. And the big question...
Had he adopted one policy?
The big question with Rudd remains this. Why didn't his party pull him into line? He remained a great talent. He was a wayward individual and a great talent.
But David...
And just a second, Piers,
okay.
just a second.
Sure.
And the extraordinary thing about the last year and a bit in Australian politics is that no one in the Labor Party made a brave attempt to pull Rudd into line.
And that's because they changed the way the ministry was chosen. Right. They gave all the power to the Prime Minister's office and he exercised.
So you repeated your point several times, David. Now may I say something?
Piers, go right ahead.
The point that Barry makes is the one that I wish to make. That
it doesn't need to be made.
No, because the first thing that Rudd did was ensure that he had all the power. Now, there was no one brave enough to stand up to Rudd as he trampled over them for those 2.5 years.
We are repeating ourselves because that's what I said.
All right, and as a result of all of this, powerful enemies are being made all round, I'd gather. Yes. And on that topic, just before Hillary Clinton left the country, she did an interview with Hamish and Andy, and that topic came up.
In your role now as Secretary of State, you have such high-level meetings. Have you ever said the phrase, "You've just made a very powerful enemy"?
No, but I've thought it.